Hi, everyone. This is Bailey Liu with the Washington State Charter School Association, your host for the Fundraising Learning Series, where I bring in experts to talk about equity-driven fundraising practices. Today, I'm speaking with Gillia Bakie, the principal for Flaker Consulting and the former development director of WA Charters. She's a seasoned grant writer specializing in corporate and institutional giving strategy and served as a board member of the Puget Sound Grant Writing Association. She will demystify the institutional giving landscape and provide some tips for writing successful grant proposal. Welcome, Gillia. Let's dig right in. What exactly is institutional funding, and how does it fit into a nonprofit fundraising strategy?
That's a great question. There are so many different ways of defining different types of funding to nonprofits, but there are a few traditional ways that people talk about it. So traditionally, institutional funding is any funding that's directed by an organization, company, or entity rather than an individual. And this really runs the gamut. It can be as big as the Gates Foundation or another large national foundation, and as small as just a little family foundation that gives $1,000 a year to their favorite charity. Generally, institutional funding is one of the three major types of nonprofit revenue, along with individual giving support and earned revenue. Nationally, institutional funding makes up only about 25% of all U.S. philanthropy, but in my experience, it's a much bigger portion of overall revenue for charter public schools.
Absolutely. In charter schools and nonprofit, especially in the startup phase, rely heavily on institutional funding. Would you walk us through the various types of institutional funding?
For sure. So the three buckets of institutional funding generally, and there are many ways of defining it, but how I like to think about it is in the three buckets of foundations, corporate support, and public and federal funding. Within foundations, there are three or four major types. The first two kind of sometimes fall together, but I like to divide them out. So the first is family foundations. These are usually quite small foundations run by family members where those family members make all the decisions, essentially. The second is small local foundations. In this case, local foundations that have open application processes or ways to access their decision makers and program officers, and they aren't just run by family members. The third type is national foundations. National foundations often act like regional foundations in the way they function, but they're much bigger. They have a national footprint, and they can be either invite only or have open application cycles. And then the last type of foundation is a community foundation and United Way type of foundation, which essentially gathers donations from many people and sometimes corporations and gives that funding back to the community. So that's the first bucket, foundations. The second bucket is corporate support, and corporate support can come in a variety of forms, including grants, sponsorships, and direct contributions from the company or a team at the company to your org. Corporations usually give to support their visibility in the community, to help build up the community around an issue of interest to them, like a workforce pipeline, and to enhance company culture. Corporations sometimes have corporate foundations that act separately from them as well and have their own strategies, but usually these are still aligned to their business bottom line. Finally, the third bucket is public and federal funding, and this is funding that's administered through a city, county, state, or even the nation, like the Department of Education. This funding is set aside for a particular purpose. It's usually from taxpayer dollars or from levies, and it benefits the community and is administered through a public entity like either a city, county, or state office, like the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, or a CSO, like WA Charters. We are a state entity in this case, in that you all administer the charter school program grants. So again, there's three types of institutional funding: foundations, which has those four sub-buckets, those family foundations, small foundations, national foundations, community foundations, corporate support, and public and federal grants.